Hi, I'm David Kais, and I run R for the rest of us. You may think of R as a tool for complex statistical analysis, but it's much more than that. From data visualization to efficient reporting to improving your workflow, R can do it all. On this podcast, I talk with people about how they use R in unique and creative ways. In this conversation, Simon and I chat about his work at Posit, the state of AI, and the packages he's developing to work with AI in R. It's a great conversation that touches on some high-level topics like what's the future of AI in coding, and touches on some really specific things like how to get started using AI in your coding today. Let's dive in. Well, I'm delighted to be joined today by Simon Couch. Simon is a software engineer at Posit, where he works on open source statistical software. And with an academic background in statistics and sociology, Simon believes that principled tooling has a profound impact on our ability to think rigorously about data. He authors and maintains a number of packages, some of which we'll talk about today, and blogs about the process at simonpcouch.com. Simon, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited because we're going to talk a bunch about the packages that you've been working on that are specific to AI. But before we get into that, I wonder if we could start by just having you tell me a bit about your job at Posit. How do you divide your time? What does it look like in your kind of daily work there?
Yeah. So I work on open source R packages broadly. Properly, like in the org chart, I'm situated in the Tidy models team under Max Kuhn. And that's for the first couple of years when I was full-time at Posit, what I was working on, 40 hours a week. Around a year or so ago, I started working half-time on ODBC, so like an interface to different database backends. Around 9 months ago, I started a book, so that's been another sort of chunk of my time. And then around 3 or 4 months ago, I did an internal hackathon centered on like AI and LLMs. And I guess that's the subject of the podcast today. That's probably, the AI work is something like 30 or 40% of my time. On Tidy models specifically and maintenance and such there, that's maybe 25%. The book is maybe 25%. For a while, ODBC and the database work was around half of my time, but that's closer to maybe 10% or so now.
Okay. And I'm curious where your own interest in AI and kind of making packages for the R world that interface with large language models, where does that come from?
Yeah. So it started off in this hackathon. The way that this worked was that some folks at Posit got together around groups of like 10 or so of folks around the company. And they gave us an introduction to like interfacing with large language models via APIs rather than like a chat interface that you would navigate to on the web. And they gave us API keys and they let us loose for a couple days. And at that time, I was heading into spring cleaning, which is a week that the Tidyverse team takes twice a year, one for each hemisphere. And we do all sorts of like code updating, technical debt sort of tasks. One of them was specifically about updating code that raises errors. So if you call stop or from rlang, the analog is abort, we try our best to make errors as informative as possible for users. And part of that has been transitioning the tooling that we use to raise errors to this new package and this new syntax, and that's called CLI. And so for context, like within the Tidy models and the Tidyverse and the RLib organizations on GitHub and all the packages that we release and work on, there's like thousands, if not tens of thousands of these custom pieces of code that raise errors to the user. And our goal was to convert most all of them to use this new interface, but it's really a sort of fuzzy like a little bit irritating task to
Right.
transition from all these different ad hoc ways to raise these errors we've put together over the years into this standard interface. And if one were to try to implement that, like some sort of package that implement or that converts the errors automatically, that'd be a really difficult software problem. And so I kind of just wondered at that time, like, I wonder how good these models are at
Mm.
automating this task of converting this erroring code for us. And so that's what I ended up working on. And then in the week after, the team actually got to use this package, which was sort of a predecessor to PAL, and probably, called this same key command 1,000 times, that like takes the code that you have already to raise an error, sends it off to a model with a bunch of information about how to convert erroring code to this new interface. And ideally it comes back in a couple seconds and you're 90% of the way there.
So that's a good example of like using AI to handle something that would be incredibly tedious to do
Mm-hmm.
on your own. I'm curious if you see that as an optimal use of AI, and if there are other things that you see as like good uses of AI at this point when working in R.
I think that like the sort of tedious in the code updating kinds of tasks, LLMs are particularly promising for, but those are probably also a subset of like, I often think about it as like 45-second tasks that could be turned into 5-second ones.
Mm-hmm.
Um, with PAL, there's like a fixed set of these that I've defined, and then also tried to provide some infrastructure for people to add in their own use cases for. And then with Gander, it's sort of more one-off, like whenever you run into one and have this spidey sense that maybe it's something that could be done for you that you're not particularly interested in doing. Those are the sorts of things where I'm really leaning on models right now to automate those smaller chunks of work that I'm not really interested in carrying out.
Yeah. Are there other ways that you think are particularly promising for AI, or is that kind of where you've been maintaining your focus at this point?
I've sort of been maintaining my focus for now. Um, I'm hesitant to like make any predictions that are too bold about
Sure.
what's coming next, just because the LLM space has been moving so fast, and I've
Yeah.
really only been engaging earnestly with it for like a few months now. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, those sorts of smaller tasks are mostly where I'm focused right now.
So, well, maybe this is getting ahead of where you are. Like you said, you've been doing this for a few months, but I'm curious for your thoughts, because you hear a lot of talk about, oh, AI is going to make, writing code completely unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's just going to, chat with a model and it'll, spit out everything you need. Having worked on these packages, PAL and Gander, and others, what are your thoughts on whether AI can go to that level?
Mm-hmm. Um, there are certainly people who earnestly believe that that's the case, I think. Um, and I might even go to say like many of those people know more about these models than I do. Um, and at the same time, like in my personal experience actually working with these models, and my like sort of cursory understanding of how they're working and where they're heading, which again, I'm very hesitant to make any predictions about where this might be headed ultimately. I don't see a lot of evidence for this. We, like in my own personal experience, uh, I get a lot of help from these models, writing code and updating code in like repeatable ways where I can really explicitly specify how I'd like the code to be updated. Um, in the big picture, the proportion of my work, like developing R packages or the work of a data scientist, um, the process of writing code is probably a relatively small portion of your work compared to like debugging and maintaining code. And both in terms of like formal evals about how good these models are at doing that, and also my personal experience. I don't see that these models are particularly capable at doing those tasks, which again, right now are like a huge part of my work. Um, and so at least in the short term, I don't fully believe the argument that uh, AI will make learning to write code unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say I could broadly agree with that. I think at least right now, AI is most useful when you can give it context and you kind of know the right questions to
Mm-hmm.
ask. I mean, I know from teaching people, a lot of times we'll see people use AI and the answers they get back end up confusing them more than anything. For example, we teach with the Tidyverse. They'll
Mm-hmm.
ask a question to AI and it'll give them a base R answer, which I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but if you're
Right.
learning through in the Tidyverse style and you get a base R answer, you're going to be incredibly confused. Whereas for me, or someone who's been doing it for a while, you can know how to ask questions in a way that you're likely to get answers that will be meaningful to you.
Right.
But you can't kind of just spew something at ChatGPT or whatever model and expect it to give you back exactly what you need.
Right. There's absolutely that skill of like learning how to ask the question. And I think unfortunately, because I haven't really tried to like put this in words before, but there's also a little bit of a spidey sense for like the kinds of problems where the model can turn the 45-second task into the 5-second one, or when it's going to give you an answer that's going to sink 5 minutes of your time because you're trying to debug it, or it sent you down a rabbit hole that's probably not a productive one in the long run.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's talk about the packages that you've been working on. So we're going to talk about two. There's one called PAL, and then there's one called Gander. Can you talk about what each of them do?
Yeah. So PAL is sort of a generalization of this initial idea I had about updating this error in code. And what the package does is it supplies an extensible library of model assistance for working on our code. So the package comes with a preset number of assistants that you can press a key command and highlight some code. And in the back end, what the package is doing is supplying all sorts of context to sort of teach the model real quick how to do the task that you're asking it to do. And then, as long as all goes well, code begins streaming directly into the document that you're working in. Under the hood, these are using Elmer, which is a new package coming from Hadley and Joe that provides an interface to any or many of the major large language model providers out there. And because PAL uses Elmer under the hood, you can use any model that you would use with Elmer with PAL. Gander is a newer package that I've been poking at recently. And I think the best way to phrase it is sort of like a co-pilot alternative that
Right.
knows about your R environment. So I think at this point, many folks have experimented with co-pilot autocomplete, where if you're working in a document, the model will receive all the code context from within that document. So it can see the lines of text that are surrounding where your cursor is at. But the thing that it can't see, and the thing that I ultimately wished it could see, was my R environment. Like if I have some data frame inside of my source file that I'm working on, my R
Right.
file, the thing that I really want the model to know about is the columns inside of the data frame and how many rows it has and things like that. And so Gander is a Copilot alternative that knows about your R environment and how to describe it well to models.
Well, and that actually seems useful. I mean, having just put together some lessons on using AI with R, I assume that works both in RStudio as well as in the newer editor Positron. So yeah, it seems like that's another benefit, that it can be used
Right.
across editors.
Right. So both PAL and Gander in the back end are implemented using the same two tools. So one of them I talked about was Elmer, and the other one is the RStudio API. And when I say like it uses the RStudio API in the back end, it sounds like that probably wouldn't work in Positron. But one of the nice things that the folks working on Positron have done is created what they call shims, which allow all the same commands that you could use to interface with RStudio to interface with Positron. And so both PAL and Gander work in both RStudio and Positron, which is a really nice bonus. At the same time, using those tools specifically makes for some limitations in terms of the UI as well.
How so? What do you mean by that?
So PAL and Gander both work by writing directly to the source files that you're working in. And this kind of feels like magic when they get it right, in that like you ask the model something and then it's there, and there's no sort of like clicking or like copying and pasting or moving around that you need to do. But the bummer is that if you accidentally get a model rambling, or if the model does something that you don't want it to do, you're backspacing or undoing to get back to where you started. Where
I see.
The other way than the way that I've been doing, which is everything comes from R, is to do it from the angle of the IDE. And so like in VS Code, a lot of these extensions have some sort of interface that's like, here's a diff. Like these are the lines that I would delete, and here are the lines that I would add if you gave me a chance to. Is that okay? And then you say, okay, sounds good, which prevents that problem of like a bunch of stuff being dumped into your documents.
Got it. That makes sense. Well, let's have you give a little demo. So we talked about having you walk through the Gander package. Do you want to put your screen up and show us what that looks like?
Yeah, let's do that. All right, you're seeing that?
Yep.
Okay, so this is quite a brief document, probably shorter than we're maybe used to seeing heading into a demo. You might have just seen this now. Right now I have Copilot enabled, and I'll use Copilot as an example for the kind of problem that I was trying to address when I worked on Gander. So I'll load ggplot, and I'll load this data in called Stack Overflow. We use this when demonstrating some packages in the Tidy models. And each row is a survey response from a developer to the Stack Overflow annual developer survey. So this first entrant is from the UK and makes 100,000, I'm guessing dollars, has coded for 20 years, and so on and so forth. So if I'm working with Copilot inside of my editor, what I probably would do if I wanted to plot this salary variable in years coded job, I could say plot salary versus years coded. This is like the plain language instruction of what I want to do. Right. So the nice thing about this, it can see that I've loaded ggplot2 because that's a line of text inside of my source file. And it can see that there's a data frame called Stack Overflow that's available to me. So it's going to suggest this code. And if I go ahead and autocomplete this and run it, it's not going to work because it references this variable inside of a Stack Overflow data frame that doesn't actually exist. This is the kind of problem that I ran into time and time again trying to give Copilot a go, is that it can generate context based on the lines in my file, but it can't generate context based on my R session. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off Copilot now. Oh, you know what? This is probably on a per project. And we can take a look at what Gander would do. So I'm going to work with the same data and I'm going to provide it exactly the same prompt. The way that Gander works is you attach some keyboard shortcut and then it pulls up like a tiny little shiny app inside of your window. So this is what the Gander add-in looks like. I've selected this Stack Overflow data and I can say plot salary versus years coded. So again, the piece of context that it's going to need isn't anything that's available in the lines of the source file that I'm working in. I need it to know that I'm working with this data frame that has these columns inside of it. So that's what a completion with Gander looks like. And we mentioned this earlier in the podcast. So instead of providing a suggestion and then you like tab or something to say, okay, I accept that, go ahead and write that into my files. It just writes it right in. And there's some pros and cons to that. But I can try to run this and that code works. A really nice part about interfacing with Gander, or another nice part, is that once it's done writing out text to your file, the whole piece of code that it wrote out is then selected. So I like this plot, but we can see that the responses in years coded are in whole year units. So there's these like lines of points, and I'm not really into how that looks. So I can trigger the add-in again without having to touch anything else in my editor and just say jitter the points. Plain English is fine. It'll overwrite that selection, and this time it uses geom jitter instead of geom point. So I can run that, and it's jittered the points for me. The sort of introductory GIF or video that's on the website for this package, I'm doing this like super fast. And it's probably a little bit overwhelming to see, but then I could say like facet by country. That's another thing that like as a ggplot user, I probably know how to do. But then I could also say like, I'm seeing that these salaries, I actually know that they happen to be American dollars. And so I can say format salaries as dollars. I wouldn't know how to do that off the top of my head, especially if I hadn't given this demo a few times, right? Like I don't know about this function in scales that labels units according to dollars. Another thing that I see in this plot that I think probably ought to be addressed is that the 20-year point on the x-axis, that's probably 20 plus. And if I went back into the source data, I could confirm that that's actually the case, but I don't know how to do that. Again, like just off the top of my head, I would need to ask a model or go on Stack Overflow. But I can say, make the x-axis max read 20 plus. I'll just run it, and it worked. So this is helpful for things that I know how to do already, but that's also saving me the time of like going to learn on like Stack Overflow or asking a model separately how to do these sorts of things. The last thing I'll show in this demo, and then maybe we can poke at some questions, is like what's actually happening under the hood. And I think this is really interesting. So I'll minimize these down. There's a function in Gander called Gander peek, and peek allows you to peek under the hood and see what's actually happening. So under the hood, Ganders are just Elmer chats. And if you've used Elmer before, you'll be familiar with this output where it tells you the way that the model has been prompted using this system prompt. And then this is like analogous to everything that you would type into like ChatGPT or Claude if you pulled it up on the web. So it's saying this is what my R file looks like so far. I typed make the x-axis read 20 plus, and there's some nice automatic formatting of that to drop in the thing that I've selected. And then most importantly, and the sort of differentiator here is that there's some logic that looks for things in the intersection of your selection, your prompt, and your R environment.
Yeah.
And so because in my selection, there is this thing called Stack Overflow, and that thing is also in my environment, it
Hmm.
will print out some information about what that data frame looks like. And so that's not only how the assistant knows how to find the column names in my data, but like when I say make the x-axis max read 20 plus,
Uh-huh.
it has the first few entries. It knows the kind of column that is, and it
Right.
knows how to format it in a way based on its range and its type.
That's interesting. So am I correct in understanding that like really what Gander is doing is it's just creating a more elaborate set of instructions that it sends to a model to be able to get better responses back? And I mean, when I say elaborate,
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean just like more language, specifically like this piece of being able to send like an object or the structure of an object alongside the specific instruction that you ask. Is that really like fundamentally what it's doing?
Yep. Yep. That is fundamentally what it's doing. It's assembling a prompt that is optimized to give the best possible answers with as little like input and cognitive load from the users as possible.
Right. Because usually when you're asking a question or, asking a model to do something, you would want it to know, the structure of your data, but it's tedious if you have to do that, if you have to
Mm-hmm.
say, and here's the structure, here's what my data looks like. So this just actually kind of handles that for you.
Right. Yeah. So like when I was first poking at language models when they came out a couple of years ago, like this process of pasting all this information in
Right.
manually was so tedious that I eventually felt like this is slowing me down rather
Mm,
than helping me iterate faster. And then with Copilot, like still I'm missing that piece of information of the data. So I'm going back and correcting little pieces of code to correct
right.
for what my data actually looks like. And this is just like one further iteration um, to where the friction is low enough to where it's actually productive to make use of these models instead of slowing you down.
That makes sense. When you said, in a piece that you sent to me that you said data science differs a bit from software engineering in that the state of your R environment is just important or more so than the contents of your files. So that's what you're getting at here, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
unlike in other like, types of software engineering, for example, the state of your R environment, or whatever the analogous thing to your R environment would be, is less relevant. Whereas here, because what we care about is like the data,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be able to pass that to a model in order to get good responses. Am I summarizing what you're saying accurately?
Yeah, I think that's very much so what I was trying to get at in that quote is that the existing tools are kind of assuming that all the information you need is contained in like lines of code.
Right.
In the context of data science, there's this other piece that's really important for a model to know about in order to complete properly.
That's cool. And is there any other tool that does this same kind of thing where it, passes the state of your environment, your data objects alongside prompts that you know of?
I don't know of any. I would be surprised to hear if there were not such a tool.
Hmm.
Like I don't know that I was inspired by anything specifically in writing this, but I would imagine that somebody probably did this before me, maybe even in R. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
So what model is it using? Like you haven't done anything here to say like use ChatGPT or use
Mm,
Claude or anything. So how do you or can you choose a model? And if so, how?
yeah. So I'm hesitant to show any specific code because the interface to make this happen is actually going to change soon.
Yeah, that's
Um,
fine.
but yes, the user can use any model that is supported by the Elmer package, and the
Okay.
way that setup works is you just tell Gander, like, by the way, this is what an Elmer chat that I want to use looks like. So when I'm developing this package and in my day-to-day use, I tend to lean on Claude. But in using Gander, you can use Claude, you can use like ChatGPT from OpenAI. You can use locally hosted models, which are effectively free. Like you're not paying for a service and you're not sending your data off somewhere else. And at the same time, the kinds of models that our laptops can host on their own are tend to not be as powerful as something like Claude or ChatGPT.
So is it then, like, I know within Elmer, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you like set an environment variable with your like ChatGPT or Claude API key or something like that. And then does Gander just recognize that? Or I know you said it's changing, so no need to show the code, but just at a high level, like how does it know which model to use?
Right. So there's sort of a config associated with Gander, and it's just an option.
Okay.
And that option says call the chat Claude function from Elmer.
I see.
Gander doesn't know anything about like that API key that you might have set up in order to use Elmer. Elmer is still the package that's taking care of all that authentication and stuff. But Gander knows how to talk to Elmer chats, and that's what's happening under the hood.
So Gander is the package that's formatting the prompt, essentially. Then Gander sends it to Elmer, which takes care of all the authentication, all the stuff that you need to do to interface with Claude or ChatGPT or whatever model you're using. The response comes back to Elmer. Elmer passes that back to Gander, and then Gander pastes it into your editor. Is that what it looks like?
Spot on. Yep.
Cool. Why Claude? I've heard several people say that recently that they really like Claude best for editing. I haven't used different models enough to have seen a difference. So I'm curious, sounds like you have. Why do you think Claude is the best?
I would hesitate to speak too definitively on this because again, I'm relatively new to this and this is mostly just like a vibes-based evaluation. And I started out like the API key that they handed me when we started experimenting in this hackathon happened to be a Claude API key. Claude tops is a peer with many of the most performant LLMs on many benchmarks, which are just like various ways of evaluating how good a given model is. And then there's also the component of like the sort of taste of the model or something that's kind of harder to capture in a benchmark or an evaluation. But I've just tended to see that the model takes instruction better than others I've seen, where if you tell it, this is what I want the response to look and feel like, it tends to give responses that look and feel like that more commonly. Yeah.
It's more compliant, you're saying.
not
like as sassy as ChatGPT.
At the same time, so like right now in the development version of these packages, it's just been the default model under the hood. So like if you happen to have an API key for Claude set up already, there's like no config that you need to do ultimately. That said, I think that will probably change before I send these off to CRAN. And that's because like long term, I kind of hope that I can host a model on the laptop that I'm working on right now. That is good enough at listening to what I ask it to do and knows enough based on its compression of the internet to complete just as well as Claude would. And so I don't want to like bake it in a default in these packages that folks should be relying on these major corporations.
Well, I'll ask, since it's been in the news, it's January 30th as we're recording this. Have you used DeepSeek?
I've used DeepSeek a couple times, just poking around. Yeah.
But not with Gander. Is it? I assume it's probably not set up to be able to use that yet.
So actually, it is possible to use DeepSeek in the same way that you would use any other model with Gander.
Okay.
On Elmer, and this is just in the development version of the package as we're recording this. So you would need to install Elmer from GitHub rather than from Crayon. But the package supports DeepSeek at the
Okay.
moment. And so you would just configure that DeepSeek chat with Gander, and Elmer would take care of everything. That said, there's been so much hype around DeepSeek, especially in the last week,
Right.
that the APIs have been down probably more
Oh,
often than
really?
they're not. And
Oh,
so I haven't looked into like logging in at the right time
I see.
to give that a try.
But isn't it, I mean, I know it's open source and it's relatively small. I guess, I mean, it's new to me too, so I haven't really looked into this, but,
Mm.
like Llama or models like that. Uh, I guess I don't know if it's small enough that you can run it on your own laptop, but I wonder
Mm.
if in the future it might be.
So the model, I think it was called V3 that they released
Mhm.
like a month or so ago, which made a little bit of a splash, but not nearly as much as the model that they released a week ago. That model is something like 500 billion parameters or something, which you can kind of approximately think about the number of parameters as the number of gigabytes of RAM you would need to run the thing
Mm,
locally. So,
mm,
you know, unless you have a pretty amazing computer, you're
that's
probably
true.
not running the 500 billion parameter model. Um, so yeah, the reasoning model that they put out a week ago, and that's probably analogous to something like O1, which quote unquote thinks for a bit before it does
Right.
anything. I've found those models to be kind of painful to use with PAL and with
Hmm.
Gander and Ensure, because that process of thinking, there's no user interface happening at that
Yeah.
point. And when you use something like Claude or a local model, you immediately start getting text streamed
Yeah.
into your
Yeah.
document. So you know that something is happening. Whereas with a thinking model, you press the command, you type in your input, you start waiting, and you're like, did anything
Yeah.
happen? Which,
Yeah.
I mean, there are surely like uh, OpenAI and DeepSeek have found ways to put together interfaces such that people know that something is happening. And I just haven't put the time in to figure out
Okay.
what that might look like with these packages.
Okay. I was listening to the Hard Fork podcast, New York
Mm.
Times. I don't know if that's a
I'm also a
podcast you
listener.
listen to.
Yep.
Yeah, so I don't know if you listened to the like emergency podcast they did a few days ago about DeepSeek. And I may be misinterpreting what they said, but I thought they said that DeepSeek would actually the whatever the reasoning model is called would give you like basically almost as if it was like articulating its thought process. I know
Mm-hmm.
I'm anthropomorphizing
Sure.
a large language model, but um, and they were saying, that's something that the O1 model from OpenAI doesn't do, and they thought, oh, well,
Mhm.
this is the kind of thing that might be incorporated because it's actually really helpful to be able to have a little bit more visibility in terms of what's going on rather than just have, like you said, sitting there and like waiting for a couple minutes until
Right,
you
right.
may or may not get a response back.
Yeah, the CEO, I think, it's the title of that person from Anthropic, put out an essay yesterday where one of the things he said was like, oh, it seems like it's a really nice user interface thing to print out all that thinking, which is something that
Hmm.
like O1 from OpenAI hasn't done up to this point.
Right.
Um, in terms of like what that looks like in PAL and Gander and stuff, again, these things are writing directly to your files. So when they're thinking out loud, it's actually just inside of a little XML tag slash
Hmm.
think, and different applications have ways of just waiting until it's done thinking, and then once that XML tag completes, the model's like, okay, I'm ready to like respond. But the way this
Yeah.
looks in Gander and PAL right now is it just like dumps stuff into your R source file.
Hmm. Okay. Huh. Interesting. Yeah, that would probably not be the best user experience. But that actually gets me to a question I was wondering about before when you were showing how Gander works. You talked about, there being pros and cons of it just pasting the response directly in. I'm curious if you can talk about those and why you chose to have it, at least it seems like by default, replace the text versus like putting it below.
Yeah. Well, so I think the nice thing about it replacing directly is that it allows for really quick iteration. And then in that, like, if it drops some code in, it's selected already, and you're just triggering the add in again, then it's going to replace the thing that it put in, and there's no like deleting or copying and pasting happening. And then on the drawback side, it's really unpleasant when a model begins writing things out to the source file, and you immediately know that it's probably not what you want to be there, and you kind of just have to wait for it to finish. Yeah. I would say that that's mostly just an artifact of like the limitations of the way this tool is built. Like this happens via the RStudio API, and the tool that I have access to like interact with your RStudio session is like modifying your files, and not necessarily like giving you a nice diff so you can like think for a second before you let the thing drop text in or whatever. So I kind of feel like, as promising as these tools are, and is even with how much time they save me day to day, I probably see this longer term looking like a UI that allows for that sort of like, you can stop the thing at any point. You can choose to reject the changes that it wants to make, and hopefully like authenticate easier too. There's this like config process that you have to work through when you first install the package, which in general with Tidyverse we try to avoid. Like you should be able to install the thing and get going, and hopefully this sort of functionality can live in an interface like that at some point.
Got it. So what are your plans moving forward for PAL, Gander, and any other AI packages you may be working on?
Yeah, so at the time that we're recording this, the next few weeks for me is going to look like coming back and revisiting each of these packages and kind of buttoning up the loose ends, or whatever the phrase is. Each of these three were me kind of learning in public, experimenting with what these things might feel like. And so before I send these things off to Cran, I want to squash a good few bugs, and at least in the case of Gander, get these things working a little bit better outside of R files. So right now, if you're working in, for example, a Quarto like Markdown, that problem of like writing stuff directly into the file is kind of difficult. And I've found that most of the time I prefer not to use Gander to write code when I'm inside of a Quarto file. Beyond that, I think trying to figure out how to solve this interface problem of like writing directly to the source file is what's next. And that will probably involve coming at this from the angle of like an IDE extension rather than from an R package that does everything that it needs to do using only R code.
So would that be, when you say an extension, I know Positron obviously has that model of extensions. Would that just live in Positron, or I don't know that RStudio has that ability, or I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure what that would look like yet.
Okay. Yeah, because I know for the AI course that I've been putting together, I showed the extension, the Codium extension, which now that we've talked, I'm like, oh, that is deficient because it doesn't have the, access to the objects that I've created. So I'm excited about your package, but also means I need to go back now and and record a new lesson.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll be keeping you busy, unfortunately.
I mean, unfortunately, that is, fortunately or unfortunately, that's the nature. And I presented the course as like, this is what exists right now, and I'm going to continue to to update it.
Yeah.
So I look forward to adding. I definitely need to add a lesson on Gander, having seen you walk through it.
Sure.
It
Yeah.
seems
I'm
really
happy to
useful.
hear that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, if people want to learn more about the packages, about you, what are the best places to connect and do that?
Yeah. Um, at the time that we're recording this yesterday, so that's January 29th, a post went up on the Tidyverse blog about PAL and Gander and Ensure, and sort of where the ideas for those packages came from and how they're related and how to get started with them. And so that's a good place to start if you're interested in learning about those packages specifically. In general, I write quite a bit about the things that I'm working on my personal blog, which is simonpcouch.com. And there's an RSS feed there if you're interested in following. And the same goes for the Tidyverse blog. There's maybe 10 or 15 people that contribute to that, but every once in a while I'm dropping in there. And otherwise, I'm relatively active on social media. So if you drop on to my website, there's links to all the different social media that I'm using relatively frequently.
Okay, great. Well, we'll make sure we add a link to that Tidyverse blog post as well as to your website so people can find you there. Great. Well, Simon, thank you so much for chatting with me about all this package development that you're doing. It's really fascinating to see.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been fun.
That's it for today's episode. I hope you learned something new about how you can use R. Do you know anyone else who might be interested in this episode? Please share it with them. If you're interested in learning R, check out R for the Rest of Us. We've got courses to help you no matter whether you're just starting out with R or you've got years of experience. Do you work for an organization that needs help communicating effectively with data? Check out our consulting services at rfortherestofus.com/consulting. We work with clients to make high-quality data visualization, beautiful reports made entirely with R, interactive maps, and much, much more. And before we go, one last request. Do you know anyone who's using R in a unique and creative way? We're always looking for new guests for the R for the Rest of Us podcast. If you know someone who would be a good guest, please email me at david@rfortherestofus.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.